I'm going to tip every game of the 2026 AFL season, and we're going to find out once and for all who is going to win the 2026 AFL Grand Final. I've actually always wanted to do this on camera. I usually do these ladder predictors, myself just for fun. I think they're kind of fun to do, and I thought, well, why not make a video as I do it? Now, obviously, this is not entirely serious. I may do another video a bit later in terms of what I think the ladder may be, where you're not just tipping every game, just in terms of what my prediction is. But I'm going to tip every game and just see how it actually transpires. Now, when you do these things, you've got to use a bit of common sense. You're not just going to tip every single favourite, because otherwise you're going to have 4 teams at the top that all win 20 games. You've got to pick a few strategic upsets in there, because that's what happens in the season. There's going to be a few upsets here and there. So let's have a look, and we're going to go through all the games, and we're going to find out who is going to make the finals and who's going to win the grand final. So Sydney Carlton, first game of the season. Sydney, I think, should win that. I think Sydney are going to be an improved side this year. Gold Coast to beat Geelong, I think. Gold Coast, they're going to be very hard to beat up there at Carrara. GWS and Hawthorn to start the season. These are tough games. I'm going to pick GWS by 12 points over the Hawks. Brisbane against the Western Bulldogs. I'm going to tip the Western Bulldogs in an upset. They're going to be keen to atone for just missing the finals last year, where they perhaps shouldn't have. So I'm going to take the Bulldogs there. St Kilda, I think, are going to beat Collingwood. I think Collingwood might start to fall away a little bit this year with their age. They've had a big off-season, the Saints, so we're going to pick St Kilda there to win that one. So round 1 we move on to now. Carlton surely aren't going to lose 2 years in a row to Richmond in round 1. Essendon Hawthorn. Okay, look, I'm going to tip Essendon here.
What?
I'm not going to do this every game, but I just have a feeling that we're going to be up for this game.
Sounds controversial.
I just have a feeling. All right, I can't explain it. I just think we're going to be up for this game. I'm going to pick Essendon by 4 points. Bulldogs against GWS. I'm going to pick Bulldogs by 15 points. Geelong over Fremantle. Fremantle are going to be a good side, but I think you've got to pick Geelong at Kardinia Park. Sydney. I'm going to pick Sydney to win that at the SCG. I think that's 2 losses in a row to Brisbane to start the season. That'd be unusual, but I think Sydney to start the season will win at the SCG there. Collingwood Adelaide. Surely Adelaide start to get the better of Collingwood after having years of being tormented by this club. Surely they break through and beat them at the MCG. Adelaide by 18 points. North over Port Adelaide. North surely start to improve. I think I've got North winning 7 to 9 games this year. Sure, if they can't beat Port Adelaide at home, well, what games are they going to win? So North Melbourne to win that one. I think St Kilda to beat Melbourne. Gold Coast and West Coast. Gold Coast by 10 goals at Carrara. Hawthorn versus Sydney. I'm going to go Hawthorn at the MCG. Adelaide versus the Western Bulldogs. Got to pick Adelaide at the Adelaide Oval. Adelaide by 10 points. That'll be a good game. Richmond and the Gold Coast. Surely Richmond don't beat the Gold Coast again in Melbourne. Got to be the Gold Coast winning that by 24 points. GWS against St Kilda. I'm going to go GWS by 20. Fremantle to beat Melbourne in Perth. That seems pretty straightforward. Port Adelaide versus Essendon. I'm going to go... we always start the season strongly and then fade away. So I'm going to have 2 narrow wins to Essendon to start the season.
Forever the optimist.
Am I being biased? Maybe. But look, that's on the card. Port aren't that good. All right, that's a winnable game. West Coast against North Melbourne. I'm going to go West Coast. If they're going to win some games, they're going to be in Perth. And they have to improve in that 1 win last year. So I'm going to say West Coast by 7 points. Geelong against Adelaide. I'm going to go Adelaide in an upset. I think they're going to be strong early in the season, keen to atone for their poor exit last year. There's always a couple of games that Geelong drop at home, or maybe 1 game or 2 at most. So this is probably going to be one of those I'm predicting. Collingwood, after a couple of losses to start the season, to bounce back against GWS at Docklands. Brisbane to knock off St Kilda by 11 points. Fremantle to beat Richmond by 40. Essendon over North Melbourne at Docklands. I'm going to go... Look, North Melbourne are due to beat Essendon. We've won, 12 in a row against them. At some point, they're going to beat us. And they've come close a lot of times.
Long overdue.
So I'm going to go North Melbourne by 7 points on that one. Sorry, Essendon fan. I just have a feeling that they're going to knock us off at some point. Port to beat West Coast by 26 points in Adelaide. Carlton by 2 goals against Melbourne. Tough one. Brisbane over Collingwood. Collingwood always put up a good performance at the Gabba, but on this occasion, I think Brisbane win by 22 points. North Melbourne over Carlton. Carlton do have a good record against North. I think that continues. Adelaide against Fremantle. Tough game, but I've got to go Adelaide by 19. Richmond against Port Adelaide. I'm going to go Richmond to knock off Port over there at the MCG. They're going to win a couple of games, Richmond. They won 5 last year, so surely Port is the type of game that they can win. Sydney to beat West Coast in Perth. Melbourne against Gold Coast. I'm going to go Melbourne and upset. There's always a couple of games that you don't think are going to happen, but they do. Gold Coast are still vulnerable on the road, and it's the kind of game you can see them dropping. So Melbourne by 2 goals.
Whoa! We have an upset.
Bulldogs by 39 over Essendon. We never play well against the Bulldogs. Hawthorn and Geelong. Hawthorn by 9 points. These are always just coin cost games. Adelaide to beat Carlton by 39. Gather round. I think Fremantle by 13 points over Collingwood in a neutral Adelaide Oval. Got to pick Brisbane to beat North. Just got to. Even though they did draw last year in Tassie, I think Brisbane win that one. Essendon, we do have a good record against Melbourne in gather round. I think that'll continue. Sydney against Gold Coast at Norwood. I'm going to pick Sydney. Sydney by 24 points. Hawthorn against the Western Bulldogs in Adelaide. I'm going to go the Western Bulldogs to win that by 20 points. Geelong over West Coast by 49 points. GWS over Richmond at Barossa by 40. And I'll go Port to beat St Kilda. The Adelaide teams always seem to get a bit of a leg up in gather round, so we're going to go Port to win that one. Carlton, Collingwood at the MCG. Collingwood, I've got a pretty good record against Carlton in recent years. We'll go Collingwood there. Geelong, Western Bulldogs. Geelong have already lost once at Kardinia Park, but I'm going to predict another loss here. I think the Bulldogs have played pretty well at Kardinia Park in recent years, and they're going to be hard to beat this year, so I'm going to go the Bulldogs in that game. Sydney to beat GWS at the SCG. Gold Coast to beat Essendon by 7 goals. I think that's probably pretty sensible at the Gold Coast there.
Quite predictable.
Hawthorn, Port Adelaide at Docklands. We'll go Hawthorn by 21 points. Adelaide to beat St Kilda at the Adelaide Oval. North Melbourne, Richmond. Look, North Melbourne are ahead of Richmond in their development. They're like 2 years ahead of Richmond in their development. It's a game they should be winning. All right, I'm going to go North by 30 points. Melbourne, Brisbane at the MCG. We'll go Brisbane there. Brisbane by 13 points. Fremantle to beat West Coast in Perth by 32 points. Bulldogs in Sydney at Docklands. That's a good one. I'm going to go the Bulldogs by 18 points. Richmond versus Melbourne. Once again, another tough one. I think I'm going to go Richmond. Richmond are going to pop up for 5 or 6 wins again like they did last year. And there should be some improvement. They won 5 games last year.
You sure about that?
They should win at least that again. I'm going to go Richmond by 19. Hawthorn over the Gold Coast in Tassie. I don't think that's a favourable venue for Gold Coast. I think Hawthorn win that by 17 points. Anzac Day. We seem to win Anzac Day once every 4 years or so. We didn't win last year. Collingwood are ageing. This is Essendon's chance. I'm picking Essendon by 8 points.
I'd like to see that!
If we can't beat Collingwood this Anzac Day, well, when are we going to beat them? Yeah, it's our turn. We'll go Essendon by 8 points. Geelong to beat Port Adelaide by 30 points at the Adelaide Oval. We'll go Fremantle to beat Carlton by 7 goals. Some of these are pretty straightforward. St Kilda to beat West Coast by 4 goals. Brisbane Adelaide at the Gabba. Brisbane to win that. Tough game, but you've got to go the home team. Go Brisbane by 22 points. GWS to beat North Melbourne. We will go GWS to win that one. Collingwood Hawthorn. Hawthorn always beat Collingwood, or usually anyway, not all the time, but enough that you can be pretty confident that they will win. I reckon Hawthorn by 15. I'm going to go Fremantle against the Bulldogs, similar to that game in the last home and away round last year. They actually travel pretty well, Fremantle. They're a good team. They're right up there contending this year. I'm going to go Fremantle by 19 points. Adelaide to beat Port by 33. Essendon, Brisbane. You'd like to think we'd be a good chance, but Brisbane are going to have to... You've got to pick Brisbane. I've got to be realistic. Brisbane by 16 points. West Coast, Richmond. Richmond won that last year by about 9 goals, but I think West Coast won one game. They're going to have to... I reckon they're going to win their 4 games or so, and they're going to be mainly home games. So I'm going to say West Coast by 17 points. They have to show some improvement. Geelong over North by 38. Carlton, St Kilda. I'm thinking St Kilda. St Kilda by 13 points over Carlton. Sydney over Melbourne. Sydney are going to be an improved side with Curnow up there. I think they had a bit of a down year last year, and they're going to bounce back again this year. So Sydney by 6 goals. Gold Coast, GWS. GWS beat them up there last year, but I think you've got to pick Gold Coast on this occasion. I just think you do. Gold Coast by 20 points. Fremantle over Hawthorn in Perth. Yeah, I'll pick Fremantle in a hard-fought game by 15 points. Brisbane over Carlton by 50 at the Gabba. Port and the Western Bulldogs. Got to go Western Bulldogs by 29 points. North Melbourne versus Sydney. We're going to go Sydney. I'm going to go Sydney here. GWS and Essendon up there. GWS will be too good for us, I think, up there at the showgrounds in Sydney. Gold Coast to beat St Kilda. Yeah, that's in Northern Territory, I think. So they play well up there. Gold Coast always win that one. Gold Coast by 34. Geelong and Collingwood. Good games, but Geelong by 19. Melbourne to beat West Coast by 30. Adelaide have got to beat Richmond at the MCG by 43. Brisbane and Geelong at the Gabba. I'm going to say Brisbane by 19 points. Sydney and Collingwood at the SCG. Sydney by 4 goals there. Geelong over Port. Sorry, Gold Coast against Port. That's also up at the Northern Territory, so I think we'll pick Gold Coast again. It's a good home ground advantage for them up there. We've got to go Gold Coast. Adelaide over North Melbourne by, we'll say, 28 points. Melbourne against Hawthorn. There's going to be an upset. So I'm going to pick Melbourne in an upset. I know Hawthorn are the better team, but there's always going to be that game that Melbourne pop up and win against a more credentialed opponent. I'm going to say Melbourne by 6 points. Carlton over the Western Bulldogs. We're going to say Western Bulldogs by 19. And I go Western Bulldogs by 36. Essendon over Fremantle. I'm going to pick Essendon in a close one.
Just hear me out.
There will be a game or two, usually against a travelling side, a non-Victorian side, where Essendon pull off a win in front of their home fans. It happens every year. It happened last year against Sydney. It happened the year before against Fremantle, where we beat Fremantle by a point. I'm picking Essendon in a close one at the MCG in an upset. Essendon by 5 points. St Kilda over Richmond. We'll go Saints there by 26 points. West Coast, GWS in Perth. I think you've got to pick GWS to win that. Hawthorn Adelaide down there in Tassie. I think we'll go Hawthorn in Tassie. Yeah, I think it's a good advantage for them down there in Tassie. We'll go the Hawks. Surely Essendon beat Richmond in the Dreamtime game. So Essendon by 15. Fremantle to beat St Kilda by 25. North Melbourne and the Gold Coast at the Docklands. I am going to pick North Melbourne in an upset by 5 points. They're going to start to win a few, rather than winning once every 6 weeks. Surely they're going to win 8 or 9 games at some point, North Melbourne. And a home win against Gold Coast is kind of one of those ones where they're underdogs, but it's kind of on the cards. It can happen. So I'm going to say North in a close one by 6 points. Geelong already lost a couple at Cardinia Park, so they're going to beat Sydney. Collingwood over West Coast at the MCG by 29 points. Port versus Carlton. I think Port at home by 7 points. GWS Brisbane. This is a tough one. We're going to say GWS by 11 points up there. Bulldogs to beat Melbourne by 37. I'll say Bulldogs by 30 points. St Kilda and Hawthorn. I'll say Hawthorn by 14 points over the Saints at Docklands. Carlton Geelong. Carlton have a good record against Geelong in recent years. They beat them last year, but you got to pick Geelong. Geelong by 13. Sydney to beat Richmond by 36. So I'm going to pick Fremantle in an upset over Brisbane at the Gabba. They're going to drop a couple of games at the Gabba at some point, Brisbane, and Fremantle are the type of side that could cause an upset. So we're going to go Fremantle by 15 points. Bulldogs to beat Collingwood by 15. Melbourne GWS up there in Alice Springs. I'm going to go GWS by 7. West Coast Essendon. West Coast could easily knock off Essendon, but I'm going to back us to get over the line in a close one by 6 points. They're always close, and we usually get over the line in a close one against West Coast. So Essendon by 6. Adelaide Geelong. We're going to go Adelaide by 9. Adelaide by 4. Adelaide by 4 in that one. Hawthorn and the Western Bulldogs. We're going to have Western Bulldogs. Western Bulldogs by 12. North Melbourne against Fremantle. That is in Bunbury. So I'm going to go Fremantle to win that. Gold Coast Brisbane. Pick Gold Coast up there over Brisbane. They smashed Brisbane up there last year in their home game. They won by about 10 goals. So we're going to go Gold Coast by 27 points. West Coast against Port. I'm going to go West Coast. West Coast to get a game, just to get a win over there in Perth. That'll be their third win of the year. Sydney to beat St Kilda. We'll go Sydney there. Essendon over Carlton. Essendon versus Carlton. Look, I've given Essendon a few charitable wins. Carlton have got a pretty good record lately, so I think Carlton narrowly by 10 points. I've got to be fair here. All right, I've got to be fair. Carlton by 10 points.
See? An unbiased opinion.
Collingwood, Melbourne. I'm going to go Collingwood to get over the line by 2 goals on the King's birthday. Bulldogs against Adelaide. 2 top teams on the ladder at this point of the season. We're going to go... I think I'm going to go Adelaide on the road. They're a pretty good team on the road. Geelong, Gold Coast. Yeah, it's not a favourable venue for Gold Coast. Got to go Geelong there. Geelong to win that one. Melbourne, Essendon at the MCG. Once again, I've been pretty charitable to Essendon. So I'm going to pick Melbourne, who have only won 3 games, to win a kind of 50-50 game. We've got Melbourne by 11. North Melbourne over West Coast. That is a home game in Perth for North Melbourne. So they're going to be keen to win these home games, though, North over there. I know it's in Perth, but I'm going to pick North. North to win that one by 11 points. Port Sydney. Sydney to beat Port at the Adelaide Oval. Actually, I'm going to go Port in an upset. Port in an upset. It wasn't too long ago that they beat Sydney by 100 points there. They're going to get over the line, Port, in a few home games. So we're going to go Port by 14 over Sydney. Richmond, Brisbane. We're going to go Brisbane down there in Tassie. Brisbane to win that one. St Kilda, GWS at Docklands. I'm going to go St Kilda St Kilda. St Kilda, they'll pop up for some good wins against some travelling sides there. Saints by 10 points. Fremantle to knock Geelong off in Perth by 19 points. Gold Coast, Hawthorn. You've got to back Gold Coast up there at Carrara. Gold Coast to win that. Adelaide to beat Melbourne by 30. GWS to beat Carlton up there in Sydney by 30. Collingwood, I'll back Collingwood to beat Port at the MCG. You've got to back Collingwood in those sort of games. Collingwood by 15 points. Richmond, North, Melbourne. As I mentioned earlier, North are a couple of years ahead of Richmond in their development, so I think you've got to pick North in that game. North by 17. St Kilda, Western Bulldogs. Bulldogs have got a good record against the Saints, so Bulldogs by 24. Brisbane versus Sydney at the Gabba. We're going to pick Sydney in an upset at the Gabba. Brisbane sometimes can be a bit inconsistent at the Gabba, and Sydney are an improved side. We're going to go Sydney to win that one. Carlton by 33 over West Coast in Melbourne. Collingwood over 20 Collingwood to beat Richmond by 20. Hawthorn GWS. I think Hawthorn in Melbourne win that one. Hawthorn by 13. North Melbourne versus Essendon. North beat us earlier in the year, so I'm going to go Essendon to bounce back, and they're going to split them. One win to North, one win to Essendon. They're always pretty close, these games. Essendon by 10 points. Adelaide to beat Port. Yeah, Adelaide by 38 points. Fremantle versus the Gold Coast. In Perth. After last year's final, I reckon you've got to back Fremantle to bounce back. Freo by 14. Essendon, St Kilda at Docklands. This is a good game, but I'm going to pick St Kilda. St Kilda by 21 points. This is usually where we start to fall away in the season. Matthew Innes, be aware, all right? About round 17, this is where our performance tanks and has done for the last 15 years. So St Kilda by 21 points. I'm going to pick Brisbane to beat Geelong at Kardinia Park. I'm picking Geelong to lose a couple at Kardinia Park this year, so we'll see how that goes. Brisbane by 13. Gold Coast to beat Collingwood by 19. Yeah, I'll say by 19 at up there at Carrara. GWS Fremantle. I'm going to pick GWS at home to knock off Fremantle. Hawthorn Melbourne in Tassie, you got to pick Hawthorn there. Richmond Carlton, surely Carlton win that one. Sydney Western Bulldogs at the SCG. I am going to go the Western Bulldogs to beat Sydney by 20 points. Port against North Melbourne in Adelaide. This could go either way, but I'm going to go the home team on this occasion. Port Adelaide. West Coast Adelaide. You've got to go Adelaide. Adelaide by 38. Brisbane to beat Essendon at the Gabba by 30. Pretty straightforward. Hawthorn to beat Carlton by 30. Collingwood North Melbourne. I'm going to go North by 13 at Docklands. At some point, like I said, they're going to start stringing some more impressive performances together. GWS usually beat Geelong. They've got a good record against them. We'll go GWS by 18. Melbourne and Richmond. I'm going to go Richmond in an upset here. I'm going to go Richmond again. They're going to win a couple. So I'll go Richmond to win that one. St Kilda to beat Port by 23 points. I think in Docklands that's probably a good one. Bulldogs to beat West Coast by 58. Adelaide Gold Coast. You've got to back Adelaide at home. Adelaide by 18. Fremantle Sydney. You got to go Fremantle in Perth, I reckon. Fremantle by 21 points. Collingwood to beat Carlton by 17. I think Collingwood win. Essendon GWS. You'd probably pick GWS on form, but I'm going to pick Essendon to win a close one because it's the type of game that we can bounce, that we can win. Like I said, you get these games against these interstate sides, and you're normally a good chance in winning a couple of them. So I'm going to say Essendon by 5 points. Geelong to beat St Kilda at Kardinia Park, so we'll say Geelong there by 4 goals. Gold Coast to beat the Bulldogs by a goal. That'll be a good game up there on the Gold Coast. North Melbourne to beat Melbourne by 16 points. Got to go North there. Hawthorn to beat Richmond by 4 goals. Sydney Adelaide. We're going to pick Sydney at the SCG to knock off Adelaide. Adelaide's third loss of the year. Fremantle to beat Port by 26 points in Adelaide. Yeah, 4 goals. Fremantle by 4 goals. If they're serious, they should be winning that game. All right, if they're serious, Freo should be winning that game. Brisbane to beat West Coast over there in Perth by 26 points. Brisbane versus Port Adelaide at the Gabba. We're going to go Brisbane. Carlton, Gold Coast. We're going to go Gold Coast to beat Carlton in Melbourne by 18 points. GWS. I'm going to pick GWS to knock Sydney off at their little toy ground there at the showgrounds. Hawthorn, I don't think they're going to lose to us twice. I was pretty charitable giving us a win in that first game, so I'm going to say Hawthorn by 20 points. North Melbourne versus St Kilda. We're going to go St Kilda to win by 9 points. Geelong to beat Melbourne by 32 points at the MCG. Bulldogs and Richmond. Bulldogs by 50 points. Surely the Bulldogs destroy them. Adelaide over Collingwood. It's about time Adelaide started to get some wins over Collingwood. If not now, when? If not, you've got to win that one. Freo by 4 goals in the derby over there. Brisbane to beat Carlton by 25 points. Collingwood, Geelong. Oh, you got to pick Geelong. This is when Geelong just start to string wins together. They often stumble a bit during the year, then they just start to string wins together at the end of the year. So Geelong by 16 points. Adelaide to beat Essendon by 18 points at Marvel Stadium. Gold Coast to beat Melbourne by 44 points up there on the Gold Coast. Hawthorn over North. I think you've got to pick Hawthorn to win that one. Hawthorn by 17 points in Tassie. Richmond West Coast. Richmond at home. I'm going to go Richmond at home to win that one. St Kilda versus the Sydney Swans. We're going to go Sydney to win. Sydney to win at Marvel Stadium by it's a good one. 11 points to Sydney. Port over GWS. Look. I'm going to go Port in an upset. Port in an upset. They're going to win a couple over there. Port in an upset. Freo over the Western Bulldogs. We're going to go Freo in Perth by 22 points. Brisbane to beat Hawthorn at the Gabba by 20. Makes sense. God, I'd love it if we could beat Geelong. Ugh.
You please. Just once.
It's the one win I would want. I want to beat Geelong more than Collingwood and Carlton at the moment. I'm just sick of losing to them. Geelong by 37. GWS Gold Coast. We'll have to pick GWS, I think, to win that up there. No, that's in Canberra. Yeah, we'll go GWS. Melbourne Fremantle. We're going to pick Fremantle to beat Melbourne. It's getting towards that point of the season where, Fremantle, if they're serious, they want to be winning these games. So Fremantle to win that. St Kilda versus Carlton. Going to have to pick the Saints to win that one, I think, by 13 points. Sydney versus Port. Sydney by 34 points. Bulldogs to beat North by 52. Adelaide to beat Richmond by 63 at Adelaide Oval. West Coast versus Collingwood in Perth. I'm going to pick West Coast in an upset. West Coast in an upset. An ageing Collingwood might start to decline. Sorry, Pies fans. We'll see how that goes. West Coast just. Brisbane to beat Gold Coast by 15 at the Gabba. Essendon, Sydney. I'm going to go Essendon in an upset at the MCG by 1 point. Essendon by 1 point. It's just one of those. I can just see us knocking over a couple of interstate sides. It'll happen, right? Maybe not that game, but there'll be games that we knock over those sort of sides. GWS by 20. Yeah, we'll pick GWS over West Coast by 20. No, by 30. By 30. Hawthorn to beat Collingwood by 20. We'll do that at the MCG. Geelong to beat North Melbourne by 33. St Kilda to beat Richmond by 13 points. Western Bulldogs versus Carlton. You got to pick the Bulldogs there at Docklands by 30. Port versus Melbourne. Late in the season, I think Port get a win over Melbourne by 20 points. Port Adelaide there. Fremantle versus Adelaide. We are going to go Fremantle to beat Adelaide in Perth by 28 points. Collingwood Brisbane at the MCG. Brisbane to win that by 17 points. Carlton Fremantle at Docklands. If Fremantle are serious, they will win that. So we're going to go Fremantle there. Essendon Port Adelaide. We're going to go Essendon to win the last game of the season that they play there by 31 points. Geelong Richmond. Surely Geelong win that at Cardinia Park. So we're going to go Geelong by 51 points. Melbourne against the Western Bulldogs. We're going to go the Bulldogs by 2 goals. St Kilda and the Gold Coast. We'll go the Gold Coast to win that. Away from home. Gold Coast by 22 points. Sydney versus North Melbourne at the SCG. Sydney by 35 points. Adelaide to beat GWS in Adelaide. Yeah, Adelaide to win that. And West Coast versus Hawthorn. We'll have Hawthorn winning in Perth in the last game of the season. So there is the ladder. Adelaide on top of the ladder with 19 wins from Fremantle. The Bulldogs third. Spewing. We missed the finals by 4%. Why didn't I give us one extra win? What am I doing? So that's the ladder. So St Kilda and GWS finished 10th and 9th in the wildcard positions on the ladder predictor. Who would have thought that? So, all right, well, let's have a look at the finals, shall we? So the first wildcard game is Gold Coast versus St Kilda on the Gold Coast. So we're going to go the Gold Coast Suns to win that one. Geelong against GWS at the MCG, that will be. We're going to go GWS to cause an upset and beat Geelong. They do have a good record against Geelong and know how to beat them. Qualifying final, Adelaide versus the Brisbane Lions. I think Adelaide, after going out in straight sets last year, I think they win a final this year, and I think they knock off Brisbane in that qualifying final. I think that kind of makes sense. We're going to go Adelaide there. The other qualifying final, Fremantle versus the Western Bulldogs. That's a good one. I'm thinking Fremantle win that one in Perth. I'm going to go Fremantle there. Hawthorn against Gold Coast at the MCG in the elimination final. I'm going to go... You got to pick Hawthorn there, I reckon. I just reckon that's probably a... Just in Melbourne, Suns coming off a final, the wildcard final the week before. Sydney and GWS in the other elimination final. Sydney, that's at the SCG, so we're going to back Sydney to win that one. Semi-final weekend, Brisbane to bounce back. You couldn't see them go out in straight sets, so Brisbane bounce back. Bulldogs bounce back as well. Bulldogs don't go out in straight sets, so the Bulldogs beat Hawthorn. So we've got Adelaide versus the Western Bulldogs, and we've got Fremantle versus the Brisbane Lions in the preliminary finals. I'm going to pick the Bulldogs to beat Adelaide in a preliminary final. Adelaide won one final, but they're not going to win two. So we're going to pick the Bulldogs on the road to beat Adelaide and go into the grand final. And I am tipping Fremantle and Brisbane. Wow. Fremantle with the week off. Fremantle, it's your turn. Fremantle are going to the grand final against the Western Bulldogs. So we're left with, surprisingly, I wasn't really expecting this, but that's kind of how I see it. Bulldogs against the Fremantle Dockers for the grand final. Who is going to win the grand final? I am picking Fremantle. I'm picking Fremantle to win the grand final against the Western Bulldogs. Now, If you asked me before I did this, I probably wouldn't have thought Fremantle would win the grand final. Just tipping every game and, you know, going through them one by one. That's kind of how it's worked out. Kind of interesting. There we go. I've gone Fremantle to win the premiership. There you go. So what do you guys think? Do you think this is realistic? Am I off my rocker? Have I lost the plot totally? Have I just... The guy's gone crazy. Has Daniel just gone totally crazy? I think that's a realistic outcome. I can see a Fremantle Bulldogs grand final as being certainly a possibility, but I wouldn't have thought that if I had to tip it without doing every game. If I just had to ask who I thought was going to win and just do my ladder in order, I probably would have not predicted that. But there you go. Fremantle over the Western Bulldogs. So, you know, get on the betting sites, mortgage your house, get on it, and select the Fremantle Dockers to win the 2026 AFL Grand Final.
All right, now don't do anything stupid.
Let me know what you guys think. Have you done your ladder predictor? Tell me how it comes out with you guys. You've got to be kind of realistic. You've got to put a few upsets in there because the favourites aren't going to win every game. That's just the way it is. All right, I'm going to leave it there, everybody. I hope you guys have a great day. And as always, go Bombers!